So is our ultimate goal no abortion, or is our ultimate goal to be able to like care for the people who are born as best we possibly can, and avoid pregnancies that are unwanted?
The crazy thing is, like, a lot of people, like, you've seen the signs with the protests, you've seen people speak. They said it's not going to stop people from getting it.
If you're going to force somebody to go through with a pregnancy, how are they going to be supported on the other end when our sort of social support network and welfare system are crumbling?
My one friend had an abortion like years ago because she already had a kid who was autistic, and she straight up said, like, I would not have been able to give this second child or my autistic child as much attention and care as they need if I were to have the second kid.
Actually get out and vote. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College, and that won conservatives 3 Supreme Court seats, and 50 years of precedent, and the right to privacy was just eroded, and like it was nothing.
You know, like how the people are talking about if you go to the doctors, if you have a pregnancy, say you want to have a kid, that's the plan, but something goes wrong, there's certain procedures that count as abortion that they won't be able to operate without. Like, I remember there was a story the other day where like the surgeon had to go and talk to a lawyer why this woman was like bleeding out and dying. And
I think the whole thing about silence is violence, that phrase can ring especially true, because now I don't think politics is necessarily always a question of policy anymore. I think it's a question of morality a lot of times, and we're dealing with issues that if you are silent on, you say, I don't want to get involved, I'm not very political, I don't want to say anything, my job will get mad at me if I start talking, you are quite literally being part of the problem. You know, I'm not the most like neo-political person ever on the internet, but I will talk about what is right. I will stand up for what I believe is important and what is right. And if you're not, you know, if you're kind of sitting back in the shadows, you're relinquishing your right to complain about something when it goes wrong.
I believe that all of us are pro-life. I haven't met anybody that is not pro-life, regardless of their view of abortion, and or even euthanasia for that point. So I see that people that are very thoughtful and think very deeply about the issues are pro-life. I believe the conversation that American politicians have been having for the last 50 years, and actually prior to that, prior to the Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade, have been having the wrong conversation for the wrong reasons. So we have not had a conversation about how to care for babies and save babies. And we have not had a deep conversation about caring about women and caring about pregnant persons. We have had a conversation about trying to restrict abortion. And I believe those two things are completely different conversations. And so if we were to have the right conversation about this, I would find that people of many political persuasions would agree. They would agree that all women in the United States, all pregnant persons in the United States should have access to appropriate medical care during their pregnancy, that is prenatal care, and that everyone should have access to care while giving birth and after they give birth to the baby. And so if we were having those conversations, we would come up with completely different conclusions. And I think we would have broad agreement.
I'm teaching biomedical ethics. I've taught that on and off for about the last 10 years. And when I get to the abortion discussion, I try to connect the major rulings, which at that time were Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, to specific ethical principles that we spend our time understanding and then using those to try to work our way through thorny biomedical decisions. Now, I always preface my discussion on abortion by saying, look, this is probably ethically speaking, the most complicated set of problems that we have to work through, because you can legitimately say that there are, two beings involved here, that that there is, to be fair, a potential life, that that to perform or to have an abortion is to end at least a potential human being.
The pro-life argument has been that life begins at the moment of conception, but that really is not fully supported by the science. There are many, many opinions and very strongly held religious beliefs around that issue. And for example, the traditional Jewish view is that a person becomes a fully living human being with the breath, and it's even considered the breath of Yahweh, and that is so sacred that we should not speak it.
But ultimately, I think that because it's so hard and so complicated, and there's lots of different ways of looking at this, that it has to be an individual's choice.
There are such varied opinions, but the political argument has been dominated by folks that consider themselves pro-life, but they are really anti-abortion and believe that it is their obligation to assure that no one has an abortion, rather than allowing the person to, the pregnant person, to make that decision for themselves.
In my experience teaching the class, most of my students, which admittedly are American and young, but it seems that it's pretty hard to argue against the notion of autonomy, a personal autonomy in making ethical decisions, especially when those decisions are about one's own body.
Sister Jean, I always block on her last name, but a nun, a Roman Catholic nun, that leads a group of pro-choice Roman Catholic nuns in the United States, and perhaps even an international organization. And she uses the term that the people that are using the term pro-life and fighting to overturn Roe v. Wade are not pro-life, they're pro-birth. And some would even go so far as to say, we're actually indenturing people and forcing them to carry a pregnancy and give birth to a child that they would not choose to have, and that the state is actually doing that now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned.
And I think if you look now at the very religious leanings, that this is very much about control over women's body, but taking control of decision-making away from anything that looks like an ability to make informed choices without, the church imposing a specific idea of morality on there.
So you get into a complex situation of what it means to be pro-life. And so thus the meme that's even out there that says, if it were about the children, we would be advocating for universal health care, universal pre-K. And of course, universal health care would mean that women would have access to prenatal care.
If they were really advocating for pro-life and to protect women and to protect children and wanted children to be born safely and then have the resources to thrive as children, there would be an enormous effort, first of all, put into birth control. The best way to stop abortion is birth control. And as I mentioned, that's next, right? So, they want to end abortion, but then they want to take away your ability to not get pregnant. The second is education. Sex education has always been very fraught in the United States. And of course, most states have some version of abstinence-only education, which is not really specifically about sex education, does not inform them about contraception. So I think, if we could wave a magic wand, we could just be honest about the ways that you get pregnant and the ways that you can prevent that. And we also, could talk about the role that men have in getting women pregnant, which is something that seems to have been forgotten in all of this, that literally a woman cannot get pregnant without a man. And so why is this suddenly a burden that is imposed on one half of the pair that's needed to create a new life, and not the other? The third is robust resources for pregnant women.
Research has shown that when a pregnant person has access to healthcare, they are less likely to choose an abortion. So that may be the most statistically significant characteristic of that person.
Now, the greatest expansion of access to healthcare for pregnant women and the children that they carry in pregnancy, and then after that, was the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, which not a single Republican voted for.
Obama, of course, the Affordable Care Act was a signature piece of legislation that was passed under him, and that was historic. It's historic and huge, and many people would say that he spent and his supporters in the legislature, both the House and Senate, spent a lot of their political capital on that. And of course, the legislature was split, and then what Obama's famous words, he took a shellacking in the midterm election. So then we had a divided government then, which is another reason that he could not leverage the action. It would have had to have been done during the first 2 years he was in office. And of course, that first 2 years was literally spent doing the Affordable Care Act. So if he had still had a House, a Democratic House and Senate in those second 2 years, they might very well have considered going for codifying Roe, but he didn't have the support of the legislature at that point.
And every state has the option to expand Medicaid, which the Supreme Court, that was the one part that they struck down. They said you can't impose that on states. States have to use that.
The March of Dimes says that if every single pregnant person in the United States had access to early prenatal care, it would save 200,000 babies per year, and it would lower the number of premature births to the degree that it would that there would be more live births and children would survive, just because of that issue of prenatal care.
It is, of course, in the reddest of red states, the poorest of red states even, that they have refused to accept the very generous offer of Medicaid expansion. And it is 100% an ideological choice not to do that.
It's important to make the point that the United States is the only highly developed country with a highly developed economy in the world that does not have some kind of nationalized system that would at least assure basic healthcare services for its citizens. We know that about half of people that have abortions already have at least one child, and about half of people that seek abortions are married. And so it's not there, it's not that classic situation where it's a young single woman necessarily.
There is still in the United States is very much a conceived morality around marriage and family, and the idea that single women could do whatever they wanted. Now, one thing that we can't forget is that, essentially at the same time as the Roe versus Wade decision, birth control became available. And this idea that single women could make choices to have sex and not face shame or consequences, that this was definitely now something in their control. This probably, as much as anything, was the kind of moral panic that galvanized the religious right on both the Catholic and the Protestant evangelical sides. But that became, all of these things, even if they start with religion, become secularized at some point. And this idea that these are loose women who are, you heard the abortion on demand, right? That was probably the most lethal bit of rhetoric that was invented to demonize both the practice and the people who get them. Like, well, we could all be reasonable about abortion, but these Democrats, they want abortion on demand right up to the moment of birth. And none of that ever happened.
A married person or a person that's already a parent may be making the decision to have an abortion because they see it as a choice between feeding and clothing and educating the child or children they have, or withholding basic necessities from them in order to try to support an additional child. So, but it's statistically significant for the people making that choice, whether to bear a child or not, if they have access to healthcare for themselves and their young children, they are statistically less likely to select abortion, because that's a critical factor. It's an indicator, if you will, of whether that person will be able to support a child and give them the resources they need. So we might talk about a classic story of a person that is, say, newly single, just separated from their spouse. And they have 3 children that are sitting at the kitchen table. And that parent is concerned about whether they're going to be able to provide for those 3 children sitting at the table. And not only just food and a roof over their heads, but perhaps one of them needs orthodontic work, braces. Perhaps one of them needs a pair of glasses that the parent is not able to afford, or even care for a child with severe asthma. If they don't have access to health care, then they're not able to manage a chronic illness like asthma. And so it puts that person in an extremely difficult position. So if they don't have health care for themselves and their children, they would be more likely to choose to terminate the pregnancy. But if they have health care, they would feel like at least their basic needs would be met, and they might, would statistically, and so this research has been done very carefully, are less likely to choose abortion if that group of people has access to health care.
Without that kind of education that showed that this is actually quite frequent, that it's essentially to normalize it. 1 in 4 American women under Roe versus Wade had an abortion sometime in their lives, and many of those women, and maybe half, maybe more, were married and had children. So they were choosing to do this in the context of saying, I have children already. I don't want another one. This is not good for me. This is not good for my family. This is not good for my finances. And of course, this is not even to factor in places where domestic violence would and could result if somebody was found to be pregnant in a way that, where they were not in a position to support that. And that might be within a marriage, or it might be violence within a family. If you have somebody who is a teenager and living with their parents, and recognizing if their parents found out that they were pregnant, that they could face real violence, real consequences.
One other thing I guess I might finish with is that in talking about kind of pro-life and what that means, when one really analyzes the health of pregnant people and say, for example, the measure of infant mortality or the rate of infant death, the United States is, and I didn't look up the numbers again to see where we are, but we are way down the list of many other countries have much better stats on infant mortality than we do. And so if that became a higher priority for us, that would be a pro-life priority, I think, is reducing our infant mortality rate. And ours is truly embarrassing for a leading country like the United States with a very sound, highly developed economy. So infant mortality is very high. So what that means is that a baby born in the United States is more likely to die than in whatever list of other countries. And I think we've been as low as 37th before, but we're certainly always in the 20s and maybe even in the 30s. But our maternal mortality, that is the death of a woman during the child bearing period of time related to those causes, we rank 100 and something in other countries in the world. So women giving birth in the United States are more likely to die than in a very long list of other countries in the world.
What can people do about it now? Obviously, Supreme Court decisions are not up to popular vote. Some people say, you can always overturn a Supreme Court decision with an amendment. Well, that's not going to happen either, right? It's a long, hard process to amend the Constitution, and then the Supreme Court interprets the amendment. The only way to change this decision is to do what the anti-abortion forces did in the first case, to engage in electoral strategies that are going to change the composition of the court. That really the only way you can overturn this decision and protect some of the other rights that we've talked about is you have to vote.
If everyone that was more from center to left of center, everyone that considered themselves in that category, if all of them voted, Democrats would always win. But there are a lot of people that don't vote because they haven't been interested enough. So there's too much apathy and too much taking for granted that our system will continue to be positive and improve without my vote, because the perception that my vote doesn't make a difference.
The other avenue that they're thinking about doing here is to embody the rights in Roe versus Wade legislatively. In other words, have Congress pass a law that guarantees a woman's right to choose nationwide. Well, okay. For that to happen, what do you need? Again, you have to have the electoral support, and the numbers in Congress to do it. Because if you introduce that bill in Congress right now, what happens? Oh, probably pass the House, right? Democrats have like a very narrow, 10 seat or so majority. Goes to the Senate, what happens? Republicans are going to filibuster it. It will never see the light of day unless they get rid of the filibuster altogether.
It does place a great deal of importance on this midterm election coming in November. And if this issue and a few others is motivating enough for people to go and vote, then we could potentially retain the House and retain the Senate. And if that happens, then it would be very likely that that access to abortion would be codified in law. And so I think there are legislators ready to do that. But this election is going to make a huge difference in whether that occurs or not.
Democrats have to keep control of the House. They have to increase their seats in the Senate by 2, maybe 3 seats, so that they have the votes to overturn a filibuster. Get Biden on board to expand the number of Supreme Court justices, and then appoint enough justices to cancel out the conservative justices who are likely to be there for a while. That's hard to do. But you boil it down to what you as a citizen can do. You have to turn out to vote. You have to first of all educate yourself about these issues, and then you have to educate yourself about where the candidates stand. You have to vote accordingly, and you need to start working in campaigns and trying to get people who support your causes elected to government office. To the state legislatures and to the Congress of the United States and to the White House.